Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Matthew Druckenmiller. I am the director of the Navigating the New Arctic Community Office, which is hosting this session today. This meeting, as you know, is an opportunity to hear from the National Science Foundation representatives about proposed revisions to the Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide, also known as the PAPPG, with a focus on how these proposed revisions relate to engagement with tribal nations when research may have an impact on tribal interests and resources. Before we get started, I wanted to remind everyone that this session is being recorded. And so if you wish to not be seeing this recording, you can keep your camera off. We do plan to make this recording available by tomorrow on the Navigating the New Arctic Community Office website for those who are unable to attend. I'd like to briefly cover our session's format and expected conduct from both speakers and participants. Please keep your microphone muted, except when you are speaking. We do plan to use the Q&A feature, which you'll see at the bottom of the window as a tool. We're going to use that Q&A feature for asking questions within the Q&A portion of today's agenda. This feature is set to allow everyone to be able to see all asked questions, and you can also upvote questions and add comments to questions. You're also free to use the chat for comments, but we really do want to keep the questions focused within the Q&A feature. If you would like to ask a spoken question, please raise your hand using the hand raise feature and only unmute when you're invited to speak. For today's session, we also ask that we all be inclusive, and this means being curious, putting your assumptions aside and seeking diverse perspectives, be professional and constructive, aim to communicate effectively, and please refrain from any personal attacks or comments. As mentioned, this event is being hosted by the NNA Community Office, which is a research support and coordination office funded through a cooperative agreement with NSF. The NNA Community Office builds awareness, partnerships, opportunities, and resources for collaboration and equitable knowledge generation within and beyond projects funded through the NNA program. And several of our team members are here today. So today we're very thankful for having with us several representatives from the National Science Foundation who worked with our office to bring this together on quite a short notice amidst many busy schedules. I'd like to especially thank Kendra McLaughlin from the NSF NNA Working Group and Caroline Blanco, who serves as the NSF Tribal Liaison and the Assistant General Counsel, for making this event possible. So our agenda today is to first hear from the NSF Head of Policy, Gene Feldman, who will provide an explanation about the PAPPG and the revision process. And then next we'll hear from Caroline Blanco, who will provide background information on the proposed revisions to the PAPPG. And then lastly, we'll have about an hour for Q&A, again, trying to use that Q&A feature. So with that, next I'll pass it on to the NSF Head of Policy, Gene Feldman, unless there's anyone else from NSF who would like to make any additional opening comments.
Well, not hearing any. My name is Gene Feldman, as he's already mentioned. Thank you so much, Matthew, Matt, which you go by, for that great introduction, including the rules of behavior, which I find very, very helpful and get us all starting on the right foot. I have been head of the policy office at NSF for over 35 years. So I've been around doing this policy job for a very, very long time. And NSF is an absolute fabulous place to work when it comes to our engagement with the community. And we take our engagement with the community very, very seriously. And that's what makes what he called the PAPPG, the Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide, to be so important to NSF, because it is a document that is used both internally and externally to guide our entire proposal and award process. And that's, over 44,000 proposals come in a year using this document. We also have over 40,000 active awards at any one time that are responsible for using this document. And we are a little unique, not a little, a lot unique among our federal funding, research funding colleagues, in that we put out the PAP guide every single year. We put it out because there are always a need to make changes to keep up with changes in statutes such as CHIPS and Science Act of 2022, which many of you may have heard of, as well as any other policy and procedural kinds of changes that are necessitated by either regulatory changes made by the National Science Board, et cetera. So this particular document, as I've mentioned, goes through a revision process every single year. And what that does, it's a very formalized process in that we put a notice out in the Federal Register, which is the federal government's official way of communicating with the community, saying that we are revising the PAP guide. And we provide a link to a draft where we highlight in yellow all of the changes that have been made, as well as provide little descriptors of what those changes are. And then we put that document out for public comment. And I will tell you that that part of the process is very regimented in that anything you say today, I really need to, if you've got comments on this document, I am going to put in the chat where you need this to submit them to and by what date, and that's June 12, 2023. Comments are due. This document is extremely important in that it does guide our entire proposal and award process, everything from what kind of funding opportunities we use to who's eligible. And I can say last year was the first year we formally recognized that even though we did before accept proposals from tribal nations, we actually acknowledged it for the first time in this current version of the PAP guide. And we're very excited about that. And it had a lot to do with Caroline Blanco's amazing leadership of a team we have at NSF that has been working on tribal related issues. But it also has other very important things like how you put that very important proposal together, as well as special processing instructions. And Caroline is going to talk a bit more about what this next generation, or at least this next version of the PAP guide might look like that impacts tribal nation coverage. We also have an entire section that talks about, you know, what happens when we make an NSF award and what it means to you and what the requirements are. These are federal awards and therefore fall under all the federal wide requirements. And that is something important for folks to understand. So if you've never opened the PAP guide, I would encourage you to do so, not because you need to know or understand every word, but because we do this document as a policy document rather than a regulatory document. And we are the only federal agency that does that. We believe that makes for a more effective communication in terms of plain language, et cetera, that articulates what our requirements are. So there's a lot of detail and meat in this document. And like I said, we change it annually. I am again going to put into the chat where any comments that you have regarding the draft would need to be sent for us to consider them. And would love at this point to turn it over to Caroline Blanco, who's going to go through something very exciting that we're adding in this draft regarding our engagement with tribal nations. Caroline.
Thank you so much, Jean, and thank you all for having us. We're really so excited that we have an opportunity to hear from you. This is an effort that we, as Jean had said, that we do put forth these revisions, and this year is very unique in that we're actually addressing things that we have heard over the course of the past 2 years. This is based on in short, this is based on the concept of nothing about us without us. And so we took that to heart in coming up with the language that's proposed for these revisions in the PAPPG. So it was sort of going backwards a little bit. Where this came about was really twofold. One is we put together a group, the Tribal Consultation and Engagement Working Group at NSF, and I co-lead that with Germelina Tupas, who some of our folks will be joining us at 2:30. They had some other obligations, so you may see some other NSF folks join us, which would be great. And what happened then is we really, this was in response to the presidential memorandum in January of 2021 and on strengthening nation-to-nation relationships. And so we formed this working group, we held listening sessions, and we have tried to reach out to learn how we can better understand what the needs are and the interests are of tribal nations. And one thing that really came out clearly, because we believe we have a lot of work to do, an awful lot of work to do, and a lot more consultation to be had. But we thought, what can we do now? At least something we've heard that seems pretty clear from what we've been hearing. And that is this concept of nothing about us without us. So this actually came about also on I said there were basically two bases for this. One was this formal working group process and listening sessions and so forth. But another was in our just daily work. I see my colleague, Kristen Hamilton, is also on this call from NSF in the Zoom meeting. And she and I had an experience a number of years back where there was a principal investigator who had consulted with elders in a tribe and thought everything was fine. And it was about endangered languages. That was the topic of the research. And we heard later from the tribal government that no one had sought permission from the tribal government, and that getting the approval from a tribal elder or elders was not speaking for the entire tribe, although it was important information to hear. But what we ended up doing then was working with the tribe, the tribal government, and coming up with a protocol for how to ensure that the tribe was aware of this, and the tribal government consented to it. And so that was a real world experience that we had, and had it not been for that tribal government to reach out to us, we would simply have not known. And so that was really helpful in providing some background information. So the actual proposed language that we are seeking to include is a first attempt at trying to address this issue. We recognize we may not get it 100% right the first time, and that once it's implemented, if it goes through, then there may be tweaks that have to happen, or rewritings that have to happen, or it just depends on the input. So as Jean had mentioned, each year she puts out the proposed revisions for each year's PAPPG, and then there are comments that are solicited. So each year may want to keep track of what is going on, and we can then hear from you if you think, this really isn't working very well, or this is working great, or if you did this, this would help. That kind of feedback is really important to us. And one thing we did to make sure that as many people as we knew were able to hear and learn about these proposed revisions, we went ahead and sent them out to all tribal leaders of the federally recognized tribal nations. We also worked informally with people, as many as we could reach out to through just word of mouth. Can you please send this to any of your contacts, and you send it to yours, and so forth, just to be sure that the word got out. So this is a great response from you all, that you're interested in sharing your thoughts about this. And we really value that. So with that background, I think I'll just open it up for questions and answers. hopefully answers.
Caroline, could I add one more thing to what you
Yes.
just said that's really super important? And that's that the comments process is so serious that, and we take it so seriously, that every comment that is submitted, we respond to. And we build a table, and that is submitted to the Office of Management and Budget before it can be cleared. And so in terms of timing, we post any new PAP guide will be posted in October with an effective date of January 2024. So I just wanted to make it clear that this is, we will listen, we will ensure that every comment that we receive is considered. And in fact, when I briefed this to senior management, I let it be known that we are going to be reaching out, particularly on this language, to impacted communities. And that's why your feedback is so very, very important. Thank you.
That's a great point, Jean. And, one of the things that we've been struggling with is that, I think it's very difficult for a federal agency to make a policy that really could be applicable to all federally recognized tribes. And hopefully down the line, other non-federally recognized Indigenous communities. But for now, the focus is on federally recognized tribal nations, because we recognize each tribal nation is its own entity, its own sovereign entity, and they may have different procedures. So we tried to keep the language as general to be able to apply to everyone as best as possible. So I think do we have any questions? Yes.
Yeah, so I'll ask folks again, if you would like to ask a question verbally, please raise your hand. Otherwise, you are welcome to use the Q&A feature that allows all asked questions to be seen by others. As we wait for a raised hand or comments, I'll ask one, if that's okay. So in my understanding of what's in the PAPPG, the proposed revisions require principal investigators, PIs, to engage with tribes to assess whether the research is impacting the resources or interests of a tribe. And if the answer is yes, they're being asked to seek tribal guidance on what aspects of that proposed work will require review and formal tribal approval. And then based on the tribal guidance, submit a request for that approval. I guess my first part of that question is that correct? And then secondly, I would suspect that in some parts of how it's written, that it could be interpreted, impacts as primarily kind of negative impacts. But I suspect that that's not the case, that we're actually talking about both negative impacts and positive impacts or benefits to tribes. So I'm wondering if you can clarify how tribes are meant to kind of assess both positive and potentially negative impacts.
Sure, absolutely. And my co-lead of the Tribal Consultation Engagement Working Group, Dr. Jimelina Tupas, has joined us. So she's here as well. Just wanted to acknowledge that. She's joined us. Also, Kristen Hamilton has offered to put the language up on the screen. So if we can, I assume she can share screen, if that's okay with folks, then you could see the actual language.
There you go.
Thank you, Kristen. All right.
Unfortunately, it splits across pages here, and it would probably be really, really small if I tried to capture both. But I did put the link in the chat for the link to this version that you can view the full text.
Yeah, I've got it. The link's out there already as well.
Oh, that's right. Thanks, Jean.
Thanks. And yeah, Kristen, if you could make it just a little bit bigger, that would be wonderful. Perfect. Thank you. So maybe if we can scroll to the top of that, it says seeking and obtaining tribal nation permission for proposals that may impact tribal resources or interests. And Matthew is correct that it's intentionally not, it doesn't say positive or negative impacts. It's just the thought was that we wanted to cover broadly any interests that a tribal nation may have that could be affected one way or the other. They would want to know what is going on, and they would be aware so that they would be able to issue permission if that were sought, or reject the proposed research that was done. So that's the concept behind that. So I don't know if it helps if I just give a moment for people to read this through and digest it a little bit, and then we can go on to the next section if you wish.
Lisa set her hand up.
Yes. Thank you, Tourmaline.
Yes, Lisa.
Hi, Jean, Carolyn, Matt. Thank you, everybody. I work for Coeric Incorporated in Nome, Alaska, and I'm also part of Matt's team over at NNA-CO on the Indigenous Advisory Board. So I'm grateful to be here. I'm grateful to be listening. And I just wanted to kind of follow up on Matt's question real quick, where he mentioned that, you know, the potential impacts on resources and interests of the tribal nation, whether positive or negative. If then a tribe does decide to deny permission of the research to take place, what does that PI have to do then? I didn't read through this completely. My apologies.
No problem. Thank you for that question. If you take a look on the screen and you see subparagraph D, this is really important. This is where this has teeth, so to speak. If there is no prior approval from a tribal nation or tribal nations, if more than one is included, NSF will not make an award. We have to have approval from the tribal nation before an award is made. So that's very short and sweet, but that is the outcome of what the situation would be.
That's absolutely wonderful. And in terms of tribal nation, you mean the actual tribal government governing the community, correct? The federally recognized tribe.
Yes, yes. Journalina?
So, from what we understand, there may be different levels of approval from different groups within the tribal nation or tribal government. And that varies from one government to another. They could be only just the tribal government representatives, or they could include tribal elders. And therefore, if that is necessary in terms of the kind of approval, that might be included in the request. So I think because we are dealing mostly with the government, that's why we noted it as a tribal government, because it's a government to government relationship. However, if your research is not going to go through, if elders are not happy with it, that's another issue that would be brought to your tribal government. So we propose or encourage you to work both ways, where you can get all that kind of approval before moving forward. And noting what Matthew asked earlier about the impacts, we would really say mutual benefit, because it has to be beneficial on both sides to be able to do these kinds of research. So although we're saying impacts, it could be positive, negative, but the end result will have to be mutually beneficial.
There is a question out there on what if consent from a tribal government is revoked during a project. And in that scenario, because an award has been made, we would have to work with the tribal nation representatives, and that would have to be a negotiated agreement to figure out what's best and how to handle that on a case-by-case basis. We don't envision that that would likely happen often, so we don't have a one-size-fits-all answer, but we certainly would engage the tribal nation and figure out what would be the best way to resolve that issue.
Yeah, that's a good response, Jean. I think that what we would do, I think, in that situation is just to build on what Jean was saying, is that our goal would be to discuss that with them with the tribal nation using the same principles that are underneath this language, which is to make sure that it's a transparent situation. They know what is going on, and that the tribal interests, the nation, the interests of the tribal nations those interests are acknowledged and respected. So those would be the principles behind those discussions. Other questions?
We do have a question in the Q&A, which is impact to who? It can get complex in Alaska. Impacts on tribes, village corporations, regional corporations, etc. Would the PI need to get approval from all entities that could be affected?
It's a good question. I think that the way this is constructed is that any tribal nation, which is one of the federally recognized tribal nations, that's what this is geared toward. But if you think that there is some ambiguity here, I would really encourage folks to provide us with comments that explain, what should be included there. Should we expand it? Should we not? What would be the benefits of doing so? We would be very interested in hearing from you about that. But if there are multiple tribal nations involved that could be impacted, then of course we would, as the language says, you could see where there's an S there that allows for more than one tribe to be able to respond.
Thank you, Caroline.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see any hand raised or questions in the chat. Again, everyone is welcome to raise your hand to ask a question or place them in the chat. Oh, we do have one question from Kitria in the chat, which is, how will tribes receive clear guidance or training on their rights through these new guidelines once the updates are fully polished and revisions go into effect?
Right now, we don't have any training that is planned for tribes. If that's something that folks think should occur, please include that in written comments. That would be very, very helpful. What we plan to do on the other end is to make sure our program officers are trained to understand this so that when they receive proposals, they can immediately look for if a tribal interest is involved, and there's going to be on the cover sheet of a proposal, there'll be a checkbox. So if tribal interests are involved, take a look at that. And hopefully our training will also alert program officers of a situation of maybe it's not checked, but they understand that yes, there is a tribal interest involved in that case. They would then report back to the principal investigator that there really needs to be outreach to the tribe to get their permission. So we do plan on having training within the agency for sure. But if there are training opportunities that would be helpful in different regions, perhaps, we'd be completely open to hearing that and seeing what could be possible to do. And I should also add that during implementation, if there are questions, to please reach out to us informally. We are more than happy to talk through issues. And if things aren't going smoothly, if everything went beautifully smoothly, it would be surprising. But we're certainly here to help and guide through the process if that's helpful.
I think we can go to the question in the chat from Brenda, and then we'll go to Helen with a verbal question. So Brenda's question in the chat is, how does a PI know if their proposal may impact tribal resources or interests? What's the starting point? I think maybe is part of that question.
Well, I'll take a stab at that, and I would also ask my colleagues from NSF to maybe answer that as well, if they can fill in some of the gaps that I'm sure I'll have here. But I think that, you know, most of the research that if hopefully they would understand, and they'd read the PAPPG, and they'd understand that if they're on tribal nation lands, of course, they would know that it would be by definition to have an interest in their research, would have an interest, or that the tribe would have an interest in the research. But it depends. Some of the things we've come across are endangered languages of tribal nations, and that would, of course, come into that. We also are doing some outreach efforts with different conferences that we're attending, for the Tribal Sovereignty Conference, Fish and Wildlife Conference, in which tribal nations attend. And we're hoping to get the word out that way as well. So it's going to be a bit of an education to be able to make sure people are aware of this. But that would be the idea, that people would learn about it through some of those avenues. But I wonder if Germelina, or I'm not sure if Regina Sievert is on yet, but perhaps those folks could help, or Renee Crane, I think, is on as well.
So let me add something to what Caroline said. When you're doing work and you're interested in working with tribal communities, first thing you have to ask your question is, how would this affect the community, the properties, the resources, etc., and all those other things that you could imagine that is part of your research work. If you feel that there might be some kind of impact, or it could benefit both ways, you start looking at who is going to be involved in that research. If it's a community participatory research, for example, that means you have participants. And are those participants going to be part of your human studies? And therefore, what kind of IRB will be involved? So you might need to see whether you need a tribal IRB for one, and then you might need to go and say, to any of those in the government, do we need to get any kind of permission to work with this community? Always remember that a community or an individual citizen represents the tribe, and whatever they do or say could reflect their tribes, and many of the tribes are very protective about that, because it will say, like, okay, this is only one person and they're using it like a generalization of the tribe. That's not good. So they would really want to make sure that before you continue with your work, is that who is going to be affected by that, right? And if you're going to have co-production of knowledge, for example, have you consulted with the community, with the elders, or whoever has to be involved in that, and ask them, how are we going to get the permission for you to be part of this co-production? So definitely, whenever it involves something of that nature, you have to start thinking, this might involve their resources, because knowledge is a resource. It doesn't have to be your physical resource. Your indigenous knowledge is a resource. So therefore, that is again another way of saying, if I need to use that, if I need to get that information, remember, a simple extraction is not co-production of knowledge. So you might want to say, okay, I will probably have to develop a protocol or an experimental process or whatever, and then share that with whoever you're going to approach, depending on the structure of that government, and say, who do I need to get permission from to be able to do this kind of work, whether it's going to be in the territory, in the reservation, or outside, whether it's going to be with urban citizens or with reservation citizens. That would be a different kind of permission that will probably be involved. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Chair Molina.
There are some, one new question in the Q&A and some questions being placed in the comment box as well. I would ask people just, if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. But next, I'd like to go to Helen. Helen, you're free to ask a question if you'd like to unmute.
Yeah, thanks, Matt, and thanks NSF and NNA-CO for doing this. Yeah, and I actually don't have a Q&A button for some reason. I'm not sure why, but I just want to definitely emphasize some of the questions and issues brought up in the chat, specifically to work done in Alaska, because I think it's a special case and definitely a lot more guidance would be needed. And who's deciding what kind of research does or does not impact or have interest on tribal nations. And the other kind of just a general, because I'm thinking, okay, when the rubber hits the road, and what does this look like as a potential proposer or a potential PI? Was there a discussion of the timeline that is given to proposers, potential PIs, to submit proposals? And I forget what the NSF kind of minimum is. It might be 90 days, which would be not nearly enough time to go through this process for a proposal. So just thinking if there was discussion about that at all.
Yeah, I'll jump in on the timeline a little bit. And that is, I'm trying to think, maybe Kristen, if you can scroll down a bit further. I think it's an exception. There it is. An E, if you can see that right above F, other types of proposals. There was quite a conversation about this internally about, well, it may take a while to get tribal permission or to figure out who to even ask. And those are all obviously very real concerns for people. And so, and some even had mentioned we may not even have the money to be able to reach out, go visit folks and reach out to them. And I think Alaska Natives were that region of the country was really an area that was identified as being particularly challenging in that regard. So this language in E was designed to try to help in that sense. So it says when a proposal includes an initial phase for planning collaboratively with the tribe, under this exception, there could be subsequent phases of the proposal. However, the part here that we wanted to emphasize is that, and also I think it's under C2, there's a reference to the phase. Like if there is a phase confirmation, yes, if you look at little 2 subsection C, written permission from the tribal nation to engage in an initial phase for planning collaboratively. So that may be something where it takes a little bit more time to get that approval, that final approval. What we were trying to get at was to make sure that the point at which the research would have an impact on the tribal nation, that we wouldn't award with, give money for unless there was permission. So if a PI needed assistance, financial assistance in seeking that permission or in helping to describe it, knowing that it takes a while, that could be something, that portion of the research could be funded just to seek the permission. And again, I'd invite my NSF colleagues to maybe provide supplemental responses to that. Okay. Oh, Renee, thanks.
Hey everyone, I'm Renee Crane. I work with Caroline and Germelina and helped contribute to NSF's approach to addressing some of the concerns that we all recognize for people who are working in or near tribal lands. And we recognize that this language isn't perfect, and that's why we would like people to submit comments. And many people have either in the chat or in the Q&A highlighted some things that could probably use some refinement. And we appreciate you emailing your comments through the process. And I think Caroline did a good job of walking people through the notion that there's an opportunity to get funding for the purposes of reaching out and developing collaborations. We have increased our expectations of our researcher community, who are the researchers who are not Indigenous people in particular, to do better at building relationships and not expect tribes to provide a letter within a few weeks of a proposal deadline and things like that. We really want better and deeper collaborations to emerge where things are of interest to the tribes themselves. And we recognize the complexity in different parts of Alaska and different parts of the lower 48, that there are different entities that have authority. And so it's tricky to write the language in a way that encapsulates what researchers would be expected to do. In the Arctic, we operate under the IARPC principles for conducting research in the Arctic, in which there is an expectation that researchers will learn about the region in which they're working and learn about the culture and learn about the communities and gain an understanding of what are the interested parties and who has authority to write a letter of support and things like that. So it takes time, and we are asking people to slow down and spend that time developing relationships and not try to rush in to get things done quickly and sort of roll over or take advantage of tribes or do things that may be harmful or don't have the consent of the appropriate people. So it's tricky to write this language. We appreciate all of your feedback and comments to make it better and more understandable. And as Jean mentioned, this is revised every year. So this wouldn't come into effect until 2024. And then there's opportunities to comment and refine language after that as well. Go ahead, Gina.
That was well said, Renee. Thanks. I would agree with the comment in the chat that having appropriate reviewers will help with some of these questions. But also I wanted to agree with all of you, what I think most of you are thinking. I've lived and worked on the Flathead Indian Reservation for 30 years. I've worked in projects in Alaska, across all of the northern tier states, in Hawaii, and every community is different in terms of who you have to go to, what the timeline is going to be to, establish a relationship, and then, in some manner get approval from the proper parties. And then the last thing I want to say is in response to Helen, a new solicitation, so a new opportunity would be the 90-day minimum, but most of our solicitations, have annual deadlines or semi-annual or something like that. So you have a little bit more time to think ahead.
There were a couple of comments in the chat. I think one of the questions was about, this is from Arlo Davis, and it's saying that it is sitting at 196 pages right now. So it'll take some time for folks to read through. This language that we're talking about is only on these 2 pages. And there's also, I think, a reference in the environmental compliance piece of it as well. And that in that context, whenever a federal agency is considering taking an action, a proposed action, in the case of NSF, it would be federal funding, we have to consider the environmental consequences and also consequences on historic properties. And in that context, Kristen and I and another colleague of ours carry out environmental compliance work, and we will work with the Tribal Historic Preservation Office as a matter of course if tribal interests are involved. So that there is reference in the PAPPG to that section as well. But we can easily just point you to these few pages where this is involved, this particular language. And also there was the other point made that NSF bundles funds or funnels funds through are to communicate with tribal governments. The guidance with that, we don't have, I'm not sure if I totally understand that, but I guess what
Caroline, I think Arlo clarified his question in the Q&A, and it's is there any guidance on how research institutions are to communicate with tribal governments?
I am unaware of any guidance. What we again, if there is something that is needed that we're missing, that's a great comment to make and submit to us. And so I think it would be really helpful to understand better what he thinks may be, or what Arlo thinks may be the issue, and how we should address it. But I see Jermelina's got her hand up, and she probably has a much better response than I have. Go ahead.
So Arlo, I am not sure if I am responding to the question properly, but NSF does not give any guidance to institutions on how they perform or implement whatever it is that they need to do within their organizations. We don't, probably we don't even do anything about their policies. Their policy, institutional policy is institutional policy. We can only work within NSF policy. So however, or whatever are the practices within that institution, you have to follow those institutional policies and practices.
And one way to try to address confusion or maybe just lack of understanding of what it is we're trying to say through our policy is by getting the word out. And what we did do, as I mentioned earlier, is we did send, this is different than the normal PAPPG revisions, but because this language addressed interests and concerns of tribal nations, we sent this out, alerted tribal leaders. So we sent an email to all tribal leaders on the federally recognized list. And also, I think Gina might have sent it to tribal college presidents. And we just tried to cast a wide net to make sure that this got out and that people were aware of it. So awareness is one of the first ways to try to bridge whatever information gaps we may have here. So, but if we're missing something, again, that's a great opportunity to, a great reason to submit a comment. Seems that there are a lot of questions in the chat or a lot of points. I haven't caught up with them yet. But Matthew, I don't know if you're monitoring.
Yeah, so I'll go to the next question. Well, so an earlier question, it was anonymous, I think was somewhat addressed, but I'll read it. It's if a village corporation president, for example, serves as a co-PI, would the PI still need to get approval? There's another part of the question. What if the tribal president is co-PI and the tribe is a partner? Would they still need approval? So it's a question really kind of thinking about tribes and close tribal partners submitting proposals and how then these requirements would relate to them.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think, we really try not to decide what or even get involved in the deliberations of a tribal entity. That tribal government is the one that needs to determine. We respect their decisions about what they think they need. And we don't want to put ourselves in the position of, what we think they should do. So if the tribal government thinks that it is okay for that PI, given that PI's position in the tribal government, that I'm not sure we would second guess that. But we leave it to the tribal entity to determine what is permission, what is the appropriate authority, and we would respect that.
the most recent two questions in the Q&A thread. The first is there something in the language that requires the PI to first ask the tribes if the proposed research is something that the tribes may need and want, and if that furthers their tribal plans? And that question is clarified a bit more with the second one, or added to. Just are there requirements for PIs to ask tribes what their current research needs are? And a part of that question too acknowledges research fatigue that some tribes may feel with researchers asking this question frequently, and coming from many different universities that are not coordinated.
Yeah, we really haven't specified exactly what PIs should be asking when they're seeking permission, but they need to disclose what the proposal is, and to determine that, we would, I guess, envision, at least I would envision, that there would be a conversation about what the proposed research is, and then some feedback from the tribal nation to explain, well, this is how it could impact us. But we're not asking PIs to ask specific questions. They would have to disclose what the proposal is that they're seeking. And then it would be for the tribe to communicate whether there are interests that would be impacted and so forth, and whether there would be, whether that tribe would grant permission or not.
Thank you, Caroline. I would ask if anyone has had a question that we missed or that's gone unanswered, if you could repost it either in the bottom of or in the Q&A or at the bottom of the chat. We'll try to get to it. In the meantime, Caroline, I do have one question about what's on the screen here. Point number II, in terms of what the PI needs to include. These proposed changes appear to me to allow proposals to be submitted with only their written requests to the tribes to carry out their proposed activity. Seems to imply that such proposals would be peer reviewed prior to receiving tribal approval. So I'm wondering if you could speak to kind of that timeline where you could have essentially a project, I'm assuming, being recommended for funding from NSF, but prior to receiving tribal approval. And has there been any consideration into the conflict that could arise from that, where tribal approval could be seen as kind of a final barrier to a proposal that has been peer reviewed successfully?
Well, we still have our hard line of saying that there would be no award unless we had written permission that was in the file. But I think part of the concern that we were trying to address was the timeline, back to that timeline issue that we were discussing before, that it could take a while, and it might make, from a practical standpoint, it might make some sense to go ahead and, as long as that request had been made, at least that is the beginning of it, that the proposal could be reviewed, but that an award could not be made at all until the required documentation was in place. And again, if folks think that shouldn't be the case, or should be the case, your comments would be really helpful to help guide us along in this sense.
Thank you, Caroline. Again, as I was moderating questions, I hope I didn't miss anyone. There's been a number of comments that aren't exactly asking specific questions, so we didn't address all of the comments. So again, if anyone has a question that you would like to ask, you can also feel free to raise your hand and ask your question verbally. James, go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking, with these, I applaud your effort, and I think the phrase "nothing about us without us" is very strong and it's good guidance. But I'm wondering, Is there any thought of potentially negative impacts of this as far as like fewer proposals that include tribes being submitted? And is there any tracking like in the future of, you know, what the implications of this may be, what they might look like?
That's really interesting. I don't think we've talked about this becoming a barrier. I think, well, I shouldn't say that. I think there have been some discussions where there were concerns that proposers or PIs might not be interested in pursuing research because of this, but it's hard to think of a way to deal with that while understanding that, you know, in looking at it, what we did was sort of a balancing test, and we said, which is worse? I mean, we think that it is worse to not have the tribal permission, but we may find a way forward to balance both in a way. And I see Gina has her hand up, which is great, because I'm just a mere lawyer. I think it is much better to have a researcher answer the question.
Well, I was actually going to comment on the second part of your question, that about tracking changes in submissions. And we do have tools. There's a public version called Inside NSF, NSF by the numbers, and then there's an internal version. And I think it would be a useful idea, based on what you said, to ask the developers of that tool to include the parameter of involvement of Indigenous communities, because we already track tribal colleges, for example. But I think that's a great suggestion. I think we should take that to them.
Yeah, and I think if we do see a decline in the number of proposals that include tribes, it may be something that warrants a tribal set aside. And so there's additional incentive for researchers, just so it doesn't, you know, stop. So might be something to think about. Maybe I'll submit that comment.
That's interesting.
Okay, we do have one more question in the Q&A. If tribal government, if the tribal government has had complete or near complete turnover, is there a need to renegotiate the permission?
I would think that if it was, if the permission that was granted was given by the duly authorized, you know, component of the tribal government at that time, it would remain valid for our purposes. If, however, we ran into a situation where there was turnover and it turned out that the subsequent leadership determined that this was really, this permission should not have been granted, we'd be in that situation we talked about earlier, where perhaps they would revoke the permission. And then we would enter into discussions, I would assume. There was a question, I think, in the chat, or maybe it's just a comment about a concern with the lack of inclusion of Indigenous relatives in the Pacific and unrecognized tribes who may have gone through removal and so forth. I think, you know, this is something that's really we've been battling internally with this. I mean, we all recognize the complexities that are involved when there are not federally recognized tribal nations. We work a lot with Native Hawaiian groups, and that becomes really difficult because there's nobody that we would go to seek permission from, or we would ask the PI or require the PI to seek permission from. So those become much more challenging, and you know, hopefully we'll get some comments from folks that will have some guidance along those lines and allow us to find a way to let that happen as well. But we couldn't think of anything for this particular version of the PAPPG, but we still are pursuing those issues.
we actually have something going on in the chat with Heather, and I did put out a response there. If you can help us with the language in terms of state recognized, non-federal recognized, other indigenous communities, we are seriously trying to get them included in this guidance, but we just don't have the proper language how to say it that would allow us to. And it could probably have the same or similar kind of process in terms of getting that permission. But as Caroline say, where will they get that permission is the issue. And that will open up a different kind of questions for us. So if you have a better way of saying it, we'd really want to get that kind of language, and we'd be happy to see how we could include that.
Yes.
Thank you, Heather.
Yeah.
But like, she's definitely going to send me something. So, but she had to go jump for another call. So,
yeah, her point in the chat was very interesting. It's true. But it puts us in a difficult position to be the ones to determine what is, for us to determine what is official permission. And that's difficult as well.
The last question the Q&A asks, does this apply to land-based research only? What about ocean or even stream-based freshwater research that may pass through or near tribal lands?
It's all tribal interests and resources. We haven't limited it to land.
Seeing no more questions come in, I wanted to just ask you, Caroline, or some of your colleagues on the online, Jean, Gina, Germalina, Kristen, Renee, if there's anything else that you wanted to highlight that hasn't been asked or brought up yet that you think is relevant for this group of folks here attending who may be considering placing comments into the Federal Register.
I would just repeat something I mentioned earlier, that if during implementation there are concerns, our efforts at NSF to strengthen the relationship we have with tribal nations and indigenous communities in general is not limited to this PAPPG proposed revised language. We want to continue that relationship and build on it into the future. So as this language is getting implemented, if it goes forward and it is implemented, we do encourage folks to continue to be in contact with us, reach out to us if there are concerns. It is really helpful that way. We can, whether it's this language or it's something else, we're learning, and we will be learning for quite some time. So anything that can be done to help us learn more would be helpful. Anything that we can do to try to communicate ways to work through our process better, we'd be happy to do what we can. So this is just one piece of the relationship we are working on building. Gina, anything else, or Renee or Germalina or Kristen?
I think echoing your thoughts that we want to get it right and have our guidance to researchers reflect how we really expect people to conduct themselves. And so any improvements to this language would be appreciated.
There was one final comment in the Q&A, which Colleen partially answered, or maybe answered very well, actually, but I'll ask it just so in case people aren't looking at the Q&A. Will NSF be able to fund small approval-seeking grants for tribes to review proposals, acknowledging that it takes time and money to co-produce and to seek equitable input on proposed activities?
Germelina, would you like to answer that?
I would like to get more information about what you mean by a small approval seeking grants for tribes to review proposals. It is not clear to me. You mean if we are asking people to put in a proposal and if they have to do it prior to getting the tribes to support that sort of like pre-planning? I think if that is the question, I think the Polar program's already doing some of those, having pre-planning grants to do that. And a pre-planning grant is also available as a response to PAPPG. It could be on anything. Planning grants is available for you to put forward and say, okay, this is a planning grant. I want to do this, etc. And all you need to do is reach out to the program officer and say, is this something that fits within your program? So those are anytime you want to put it, it's available for you to submit. There's no deadline for planning grants. Colleen, want to add?
Yeah, thanks, Germelina. I think you summed up kind of what I answered in the Q&A, just to kind of, I like to kind of say that there are different tiers that I like to kind of provide for these relationship building activities. And one is just a workshop grant if you want to kind of get people in the room together to hash out your research questions and create partnerships. The next level are planning grants, and they're up to about $200,000 to really put people in the room to hash this out. And then finally, we also offer research coordination networks proposals. So those are kind of your options there to help put your partnerships in place and to build those relationships and support the time that is needed to, you know, get people in the same room together. As Renee said, definitely reach out to a program officer that you think, you know, that can provide you with advice. And I'll also just say, you know, the NNA Community Office is an excellent boundary organization that we're funding right now that, you know, holding events like this, they hold networking events. ARCUS is the same thing. So Helen is kind of leading up ARCUS. So both of those organizations are really excellent for, you know, providing that advice, providing networking activities and different resources to really get trained up in some of these things too. But if you have any questions at all, you know, any of the program officers in the Arctic Sciences section is more than happy to help answer any questions.
Thank you, Colleen. We covered a lot of ground with these questions. I know we had set aside time for the until half past the hour, but it seems as though the questioning is winding down, and want to be mindful of your time, Caroline, especially for answering all of these questions. So I would like to remind people that we have recorded this session, and we do plan to post it on the NNA Community Office website, hopefully by tomorrow, recognizing that this comment period is opened only through June 12th, which is less than 2 weeks away. So we want to get that out to folks to be able to see, especially those who were unable to join us today. So if there are, I'll look to you, Caroline, to see if you have any closing comments, but I wanted to just say thank you so much for joining us today and answering these questions. It's really nice to have this opportunity to speak directly with you about these proposed changes.
Well, we're really grateful to have this opportunity to hear from everyone that that shared with us. That's really helpful as we consider what to do next and how to make this better. And just to reiterate what Jean had mentioned at the beginning is that if there are comments that people have, they have to be in the official record, and that means answering or submitting those comments through the website that Jean had put in the chat at the beginning of the session. So the comments that we've discussed today and the questions that were asked, those wouldn't be part of that official document. So I just want to emphasize that so everybody is aware that in order for them to be considered officially, we can go ahead and include those if they are submitted through the formal channels. So that is that's what we would need to do.
Caroline, there's one question from Lisa. Says, what about community advisory boards? Do those count as participatory?
I think, let me just see. I mean, Renee, do you think you could answer that for us about the community advisory boards? I mean, the revised PAPPG language just concerns federally recognized tribes. So I'm not sure how this comes into play.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think it just depends on the different communities and what role that community advisory board has and what authority they have to make agreements or give approvals. So I think it will vary from community to community.
Thank you.
You know, so for example, where I live and work, there are 2 culture committees, as well as the tribal government, as well as the tribal college. So in some cases, I would have had to go to 4 different entities to get approval. So yeah, I think that idea of an advisory board varies with the community and what their role is.
Thank you.
Thanks for asking. Well, I also want to emphasize that if any other questions come up, feel free to reach out to us. I mean, we'd be happy to try to answer what we can.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and others from NSF who took the time to join us today, and for everyone joining us on such short notice. Again, amidst the holiday weekend and many busy schedules, it was not straightforward for the stars aligned to have this event. So I appreciate everyone joining us on such short timeline. And please feel free to reach out to the community office for any feedback or suggestions about these types of events in the future. And we will be, as mentioned, posting this recording on our website. So thank you, Caroline. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.